In 1969, El Salvador and Honduras went to war just days after a World Cup qualifier. Historians still argue about how much of that war was really about football. But here is what nobody argues about. For those 100 hours, two nations poured their identity, their rage, and their grief into the question of which 11 men could put a ball in a net. That sounds ridiculous, until you realize a smaller version of the same machinery has been sitting in every stadium, every pub, every living room, and every World Cup ever since. So what actually happens inside a man's brain when he watches 11 strangers play football? Why can a match he didn't play in a city he's never been to feel like something deeply personal happened to him? The answer starts long before football, long before modern sport. It starts with one of the oldest problems in human life. Which group do I belong to? And what happens to me if it loses? For most of human history, that wasn't some abstract identity question. It was a survival question. A human being did not survive alone. He survived in a group small enough to know, track, and trust. Anthropologist Robin Dunbar spent years studying how large human groups can get before relationships start to break down, and the number kept landing in roughly the same place. Around 150 people a brain can meaningfully hold together. Beyond that were strangers. And in the world we evolved in, strangers were not neutral. If your group lost, you didn't just lose status. You could lose food, territory, protection, even the group itself. So the men who survived were not the ones who treated belonging as a nice social preference. They were the ones whose bodies treated the group's fate as their own. That instinct never disappeared. It just changed costumes. A tribal marker became a club badge. A war chant became a stadium chant. A survival group became a team. And for a lot of men, football became one of the last places where that ancient instinct still has somewhere obvious to go. Because football doesn't just give men a sport to watch. It gives him a side. And that matters more than it sounds. Listen to the language football fans use, and the shift happens almost immediately. Not they won, but we won. Not that defender was terrible, but we were awful at the back. The grammar changes first, then the identity follows. A person stops talking about a team as if it's an object in the world, and starts talking about it as if it's an extension of himself. The line between I support this club and I am on this side gets thinner and thinner until it almost disappears. And once that happens, the emotional math changes completely. A result doesn't feel like information anymore. It feels like something happened to you. That's why football can hijack an entire weekend. That's why a missed penalty can ruin a man's mood for 2 days. That's why a club he has never played for, in a city he's never lived in, can still feel close enough to wound him. Because once a team becomes part of the self, a loss doesn't arrive as neutral news. It arrives as damage to the group, and the group no longer feels separate from the person watching. Psychologist William Swan spent years studying something called identity fusion, the point where the line between me and my group starts to collapse. It's the moment a person stops merely belonging to a group and starts experiencing the group's fate as if it were his own. Football is one of the cleanest modern machines for producing exactly that state. It gives man a side. It gives him colors. It gives him songs, enemies, rituals, humiliations, revenge arcs, and legends. It gives him a reason to say we and mean it. And that we does a huge amount of psychological work, because adulthood is, for a lot of men, much lonelier than they expected it to be. Friendships thin out, people move away, work expands and hardens around the edges of life. The old structures, school, neighborhood, university, that once made belonging automatic quietly disappear, and nothing replaces them by default. Football fills that gap with almost absurd efficiency. It tells you where to be, who your people are, which rival matters, which victories are sacred enough to keep replaying forever. It gives adult life a recurring ritual. Every weekend, the same matchday rhythm returns, the same pub fills up, the same group chat wakes up, the same father is texting the same son. Men who would never sit down and say, I think I need a community, still find themselves in the same place, caring about the same thing, using the same pronouns. And that is not trivial. Belonging rarely arrives pre-built in adult life. You have to build your own structures, your own reasons together, and a lot of men don't have many effortless ways to do that. Ways where connection happens on a schedule and nobody has to say, let's talk about our feelings. Football solves it almost by accident. You don't have to explain your loneliness. You don't have to invent a ritual from scratch. You just watch the match. And suddenly you're in a room where everyone already understands the stakes. Not life or death stakes, shared stakes. And shared stakes are one of the fastest ways human beings bond. That's why a football crowd can feel so intense. 40,000 strangers, all wearing the same colors, all moving toward the same moment, all waiting for the same release, the same inhale before a penalty, the same eruption after a goal, the same groan after a miss. For 90 minutes, a stadium full of strangers becomes synchronized around one emotional object. Researchers who study crowds have found that moving, singing, or chanting together increases oxytocin, one of the hormones involved in trust and bonding. A football crowd doesn't just feel like a crowd. To the nervous system, it can feel much closer to a tribe. But belonging is only part of the story. Football also gives men something modern life often makes surprisingly difficult: a place to feel huge emotions without having to apologize for them. Because in a lot of cultures, boys are raised with a very narrow list of emotions they are allowed to show. Anger, allowed. Pride, allowed. Confidence, allowed. But grief, tenderness, fear, deep joy, hugging another man because you're overwhelmed, not so much. Psychologist Ronald Levin spent years studying men raised under traditional masculine norms. His finding wasn't that these men feel less, it was that they are trained, early and hard, to show less, to keep the voice level, to keep the face still, to keep the body under control, to treat emotional intensity like something faintly embarrassing. And then football happens. Now a man can scream, he can cry in front of strangers, he can throw his arms around another man after a single goal and nobody questions it. For those 2 hours, emotion becomes socially safe. That matters because a lot of adult male life is built around restraint. Football breaks that rule. It creates one of the few public spaces where men can be devastated, euphoric, sentimental, affectionate, and completely overwhelmed without having to explain themselves. So the reaction isn't only about the match, it's also about what the match gives them permission to feel. And once you combine those 2 things, group belonging and emotional permission, football starts to make a lot more sense. It gives men a tribe large enough to disappear into, and a ritual strong enough to make that belonging feel real in the body. It lets them stop being isolated individuals for a while and become part of a shared emotional event. That's why victory feels so powerful. Football hands men a sense of status that has nothing to do with anything they personally did. We won. We destroyed them. We are back. We are the best. 11 strangers ran, scored, defended, missed, recovered. The man on the sofa did none of it. He didn't touch the ball, he didn't sprint, he didn't tackle anyone, and yet his body still reacts as if something happened to him. In 1998, researchers Paul Bernard, James Debs, and colleagues at Georgia State University took saliva samples from male fans before and after matches, from men inside the stadium and men watching from home. The pattern was the same in both groups. When their team won, testosterone rose. When their team lost, it dropped and stayed lower for hours. These men never stepped onto the pitch, and their bodies still reacted as if the result belonged to them. That doesn't mean football is a fake version of war or that men are secretly primitive. It means the line between individual and group is much easier to blur than modern life likes to admit. In the world we evolved in, your group's victory really was your victory. If your side won, your chances of eating, surviving, and staying protected improved with it. There was no clean line between the group's success and your own. Football obviously isn't that. No one's actual safety changes because a club gets relegated. But the emotional machinery that tracks group success and group failure didn't vanish just because modern life became safer and more bureaucratic. It just found new symbols to attach itself to. A club crest, a national shirt, a league table, a final whistle. And football is uniquely good at feeding that machinery because it is so brutally clear. There is a scoreboard, a winner, a loser, there is a rival, there is a history of wounds and payback that can be carried for decades. But there is one more layer here, and it might be the most important one: memory. For a huge number of men, the love of football didn't begin with a sport. It began with a person, a father who never said "I love you," but sat next to his son every Saturday in the same seat, saying almost nothing, both of them wincing at the same missed chance. A grandfather's team passed down almost like a surname. A club tied forever to one street, one kitchen, one television, one version of your life that doesn't exist anymore. Sociologist Anthony King, who studied football fandom across generations, described exactly this. Support for a club often gets passed down less like a hobby and more like an inheritance. Not just loyalty to a team, but loyalty to a whole web of memories and people wrapped around that team. And once that happens, football stops being just entertainment in a completely different way. Now it's not only about the group in front of you, it's also about the people behind you. The father who watched with you, the brother who moved away, the friend you no longer speak to but still think of when the anthem starts, the apartment where the TV was always too loud, the pub that closed 10 years ago, the version of yourself who was 15 or 22 or still living at home or still thought life would unfold in a very different direction. A football club becomes a storage device for all of that. Not just goals and trophies, but entire emotional periods of a man's life. So when a man watches his team, he may not just be watching football, he may be watching his father, his childhood, his city, his old friendships, a version of himself from before life got complicated, or before it got lonely, or before the people around him started disappearing. And once you understand that, the emotional intensity makes a lot more sense, because when his team loses, he isn't only losing a match. For a moment, he is losing contact with everyone and everything he has attached to the team. The sight his father gave him, the ritual that made a certain room feel like home, the bridge back to a version of his life that no longer exists anywhere else. That's why football grief can feel so oversized. It isn't only about the scoreboard, it's about everything the scoreboard has been wired into over the years. Put all of that together, the ancient need to belong to a group, the rare permission men are given to express emotion openly, the borrowed status of collective victory, the weekly ritual of showing up with your side, and the deep family memories stitched into fandom. And football stops looking like 90 minutes of men caring too much about a ball. It starts looking like one of the last places where a huge, quiet part of male experience is still allowed to exist in public. When the final whistle blows, nothing material has really changed. No one's rent gets paid. No one's marriage is fixed. No one becomes safer because their club won on Saturday afternoon. And yet something real still happened. For a few hours, a man got to belong to something larger than himself. He got to care without embarrassment. He got to feel grief, joy, rage, hope, superstition, loyalty, and relief in public. He got to borrow the shape of a tribe in a world that often leaves men emotionally ungrouped. He got to touch, however briefly, a line that runs backwards through fathers, brothers, sons, old friends, old rooms, old versions of himself. All of that with none of the actual danger our ancestors once paid for group belonging. That isn't shallow. It might be one of the strangest and safest emotional outlets our species has ever built for an instinct this old. So the next time you see a grown man in tears over a match he didn't play, or hugging a stranger in the street because they wear the same badge, don't dismiss it as an overreaction. You are watching belonging, grief, status, memory, and inherited love all showing up at once in one of the only places modern life still allows them to. And somewhere inside you, whether you've ever cared about a single match or not, some version of that same machinery is still there too, waiting for a group worth defending.